Okay, so this, I'm anticipating we're going to do something a little bit different than the last time. What I want to do is sort of give you some ideas about what is expected in the self-study and what is expected in the visit. And then, depending on questions that you have, things that you want to know more about, we can focus in more on that, or we can take some of the standards and go point by point and see how you think Delhi's doing with those. Okay? So that's the plan. Everybody okay with that? Good. Good plan. Thank you for that. Okay. So can I ask, first of all, how many of you are veterans of the self-study process? You've been through it before? Okay, a couple. Some of you. Okay, great. How many of you are faculty? How many of you are not? Okay, great. I guess just give me a little bit of an idea of what we got. Do you have any burning questions that you want me to answer in the course of this hour? How people are addressing Standard 6? Okay, great. Well, let me take you through what I've got for you. And then ask me questions, seriously, interrupt me, ask me questions as we go. I'm very happy to do that. The more interactive it is, the happier I am, so all good. Okay, we get this question a lot. What does Middle States want? And this is, did I turn it on? You were witnesses, right? It worked the last time. I mean, it worked just a little bit ago. Oh, there we go. Did you do that or did I do that? I did that? Oh, good. Okay. Look, I'm in control. Okay. So the most important thing about self-study, you want to be as honest as possible. Do not let your PR people get a hold of this. That's really bad. We'll take you through. Okay. You have a choice of how you want to approach it. This is my understanding. I've not yet been through their new self-study training. Hoping to do that soon. But what I understand from the Middle States people is that this, and their website, which has tons of information on it. So priority-based or standards-based. For my money, I would do standards-based. I think you have a better shot at getting everything in there that you need to do. Priority-based means you're looking at your strategic planning priorities and linking them to the standards, and then you have to cover the rest of the standards that may not be related to your priority. But as I said earlier, a lot of these themes show up throughout the standards, so you can use your own judgment on that, but I would go with standards-based. This is something that very often presidents have a certain perspective on. They want the self-study to be something that portrays the college in a really great light. I had a colleague where I was before who used to write a lot of this stuff, and he used to call himself the institutional fig leaf. Reference to. I would say that it's more important for you to be brutally honest. You want them saying things like, I think you're being too hard on yourselves, rather than, really? I think you're hiding something. I'm going to dig deeper. Okay. Well-researched, well-evidenced. Okay. Rigorous and scrupulously documented. I've looked at a lot of these. Sometimes I review them, or just, people ask me for feedback on them. The most common feedback I give is you're making claims that you're not supporting. That happens all the time. What you can't say is everybody knows this. For a smaller institution, it's a temptation. But all the team member has to do is walk down the hall and say, hey, do you know what your budgeting process is? And if the person doesn't know, they say, well, obviously everybody doesn't know this. what they're going to look for is documentation, and they're going to look for conversations on campus which support the documentation. They're there to validate what you've done and to determine your compliance with the standards. It's those two things that are really the predominant point. I maintain, because I used to be English faculty, that it would be very helpful if you had English faculty members read this as if it were a freshman student's term paper. You want evidence. And if you're making claims you can't support, that's highly problematic. And if you've got evidence that supports your, and this is going to be tricky, I think, because they're changing how they do this now. You're submitting standard by standard into the portal. So how you link the evidence inventory with the document itself is a question. You will be asked to go to a self-study institute. I don't know who from your institution would go, but that would be one of the questions I would ask, is how do I link in the document to the evidence that the team is going to want? The easier you make it for the team, the happier they're going to be, the more likely it is that they are going to give you the benefit of the doubt. So, brutal honesty, make it easy for the team, provide snacks. I mean, seriously. A lot of times these folks are up until really late at night in the hotel trying to figure out what to do. They want to know, they're going to debate whether they find you in compliance or not, or they're going to debate things like, we had one, they went until 4 in the morning, and they ended up giving the institution 23 recommendations. So my guess, from my experience, would be they were very much undecided about whether the institution was in compliance or not. So they went this way, they gave the institution the benefit of the doubt, but anyway. So the easier you make it for them, the better off you're going to be. Okay. Oh, we just did that, right? So everyone should read the self-study. This is a tough sell. I mean, you're going to have folks that are in the offices that are in the classroom saying, no, I'm not going to read that. But they're going to want to know, what's your involvement in the process? How widespread is engagement with this? Have people had a chance to read it and comment on it? So I was working with a team at one institution, and the team chair was a president from New Jersey. And he did his preliminary visit with the campus and talked to the administration and said, you haven't read this document. The reason I know you haven't read this document is here are some of the things in it that I know you would have a problem with. So everybody should read it. You should be able to answer questions about it. It's not unusual to have a team come and ask to talk to the steering committee and say, okay, tell me about the process. Tell me about how you engage the campus. And they're going to ask that of many groups. What was your experience with this process? What was your involvement? How did you participate? So the more participation you have, the better. This is a change in expectation from years ago. And this is where we have challenges with administrators particularly, but often faculty who as well, who would say, you know, I did this before. It's no big deal. The president who said, oh, I can write a self-study in a weekend. No. The first question out of the team's mouth is, well, you know, what's your engagement? What's everybody's engagement? Have you seen this? Has your college council seen this? Or if you have a board, has your board seen this? Have your student government seen this? Who has seen this? Who has responded to it? Have your governance bodies read it? Every group, every possible group, should at least have some member of it who's conversant with the document. What kind of documentation? So I did mention this before, but I think this deserves actually a little more focus. Plans are certainly evidence, but they're plans. They don't tell you what's been done so far. They don't tell you, well, they might tell you who's accountable for what, but if they don't, they should. Data, as I said, data are not the only focus. What you're looking for is evidence, and that takes many, many different forms. Reports, surveys. So one of the big problems that especially non-academic units run into is over-reliance on survey data. So the first question for many student affairs folks will be, well, we did the student opinion survey, and we got this. Okay, fine, but then what did you do? Did you have focus groups? Did you look at did you draw any conclusions about evidence that may be available to you to inform you more? Student opinion survey, any kind of survey, gives you data points that you might want to dig into more deeply. That draws attention to what's meaningful for people and what isn't. So, to the point, student opinion survey for where I was before, and that's the community college, right? And we got comments on residence halls. We didn't have a residence hall, but we were rated very highly on them. Students don't always know the language of the questions that they're being asked. And so you have to be very careful what conclusions you draw from survey data. A lot depends on what the question actually says. And again, know your demographics. What are they thinking? We knew that we didn't have residence halls, so we knew to discount that. But a better question would have been, what are they thinking about when they're commenting on residence halls? What do they think they're commenting on? And does that point to a need? Does that point to an issue? What? So, and of course, parking, food services, inevitably. I don't know a student ever who's been happy with parking or food. But I was at one institution in the last couple of years, and the teams know. They know the same thing. They have the same thing at their institutions. They're peers, right? But we heard from every single student everywhere that the food was different for some groups of people than it was for regular students, and they really hated the food. So there's we hate the food, and then there's we really hate the food, and there's a problem here. And the team has to make a judgment as to how to assess whatever is going on. Okay, talked about work orders and things like that, meeting minutes. Do you guys have any questions about those and how you might incorporate any of these different data points into your work? Yes.
Do one for every single year, and that way show them what are the most important things that we dealt with that year.
Yeah, so the question really about how do we contextualize the meeting minutes? Yes. So you'll want to make a statement about how you're using your meetings. Okay, and then you're going to give some examples of the evidence. And then in the evidence inventory, you're going to want something that is complete. So if you're saying that faculty department meetings talk about assessment regularly and make decisions based on assessment data, make plans, it's linked to budgeting, you need examples of that, a few, because you don't have a huge amount of room to work with. But then they're going to want to dig more deeply into that and see how is the institution as a whole doing that. And you can't put everything into the one example. So you're going to want to decide amongst yourselves how you want to present that in the evidence inventory as an indication that the entire college is doing, or what proportion of the college is doing. Does that make sense? Okay, and there was a question.
Do you think that photographs would be appropriate?
I think anything can be evidence. It depends on the point you want to make. So what are you thinking in terms of photographs of what?
Construction projects, final projects.
It would need to be in support of a point. So you don't want to do what they call a data dump. You don't want to just throw everything at the wall and see what sticks. And you don't want to overwhelm the team with too much information that doesn't make a point. In the past, what's been problematic is people will give the team passwords to their task stream. And then you have to, because I tried to do this, you have to spend 15 million hours trying to figure out what the status is using something that you may or may not be familiar with and digging through just tons and tons of information. You want to make a point, do the analysis, and then provide evidence to support that analysis. Okay? reporting, the documentation truly is one of the biggest issues for people who are doing assessment regularly and just don't write it down. It's helpful if when you're writing it down, you have some organization to it. It's helpful if there's some kind of standard format, because that gives the team a way to look at the information more meaningfully. But barring that, you at least need to be able to talk about it and provide evidence that it's happening. So the more you write down, the better. The more organized what you write down is, the better. Okay? So you want summary, as we just said, summary, and then examples, analysis, and then access to the organized evidence inventory. That's the term that they're using now, evidence inventory. So I like that they're focusing on evidence rather than data, because it's much broader umbrella, and it makes sense. Okay, don't just get passwords and access. Yes? Yeah, they have, so yes, it is.
Is there any sort of specific type of way that they want the evidence turned in? Any sort of system? Or, is it limited to paper or digital or?
So it will definitely be digital, because that's how they're submitting everything now, is digitally into the portal. How that gets done, and then how you make that available to the SUNY liaison, or the team members will have access to the portal. Liaison may not. So you will want a couple of paper copies of what you've got for people who need to read it and who don't have access to the portal. And for the rest of that question, you'll need to ask the Self-Study Institute. And it's a really good question, but I just don't know the answer. Okay, so table of contents, navigated labeling system, links to evidence, and easy return to the document. When this was done all electronically and you had one document, you could hot link your evidence. And then what would happen a couple of times is that you get to the evidence link and then you couldn't get back, which is a royal pain. But again, the easier you can make it for the team, the better off you're going to be. How this gets done in the current system, I do not know. And that's where you need to be asking that question at the Institute, or of your Middle States Vice President. The Middle States Vice President is your liaison at Middle States, and if they can't answer the question, they would know who at Middle States could answer the question. Okay. This I want to show you because one of the things that is problematic for a lot of places, yeah, you don't have to stand on your head, okay? But it's problematic in a lot of places is trying to give an overview of where the assessment efforts are on campus. Now, this is taken from an institution that obviously had some problems with assessment. What they did was they took each piece of the assessment process and each department and then looked at what pieces were complete, and they color-coded them. We call this a heat map. So they color-coded them according to how the degree of completion of what was going on. This, to me, is a very easy way to get an overall picture of the status of assessment at the institution. It gives you a global picture. Okay, and it also is a good self-study document because it also tells you and your peers within the institution who's playing ball and who's not. Now, for this particular exercise, they removed the names of the programs on the left, so that it was a non-shaming exercise at the moment. But you can certainly do something very comprehensive that gives the same type of overview of the institution. And here you can see they had some work to do. But if you start with something like this, and you see you have some work to do, and then you do another one in a year, you can see the progress very clearly between the one and the other. So I recommend it to you, the college that did this. Certainly I know people there. If you want to follow up with that, I can give you contact people. But I think it's a really great summary document and a great way to present what you're doing. Okay, I mentioned this before. I think this is a really good way to start self-study. So this is what the thing looks like, and it's way too small to read from where you are, but the link will give it to you directly. I'm going to use this with the leadership team later today. I would encourage departments to do it. I would encourage, various groups, your curriculum committee, your whatever kind of governance committees you have. The more people who look at this and say, yes, this, not that, here's where I think we are, this I think we're doing really well, but somebody else will say, no, we're really bad at that. Then the conversation is the important part. Conversation about where you are as an institution. So to me, that, I think very often this gets misconstrued. We've tried to be really, really specific about it when we constructed this. It's not intended to be an evaluation. It's intended to be a basis for discussion. So in that sense, it is a real exploration of the institution, what your status is with regard to the things that matter for institutional effectiveness. We do have another one for program learning outcomes, which you can access on the SCOA website. This one is the one that I think is best for overall institutional discussion. And so you can see, we looked at, do you have a plan? I think you have a plan. Do you have outcomes? Do you have alignment of those outcomes? What does it look like? The resources, are they there? The culture, is it there? The data focus, is that there? Is the plan sustainable? Is the process sustainable? So when we did this study, we found very few, we looked at all of the recommendations and requirements about assessment across the system. And we found very few that said, you guys aren't doing this at all. The most recommendations that we got in any category were about sustainability of the process. So, as I said before, if you have an administration that basically you've been out of compliance and they throw everything at it, the biggest concern from the team is going to be this process isn't sustainable. You can't keep this going. It's way too labor intensive. It's way too complicated. So part of the whole deal is to assess your assessment, which sounds like more work, I know. But basically, you're going to know it. You're going to know it from things like the heat map. You're going to know it from, burnout. You're going to know it from the degree to which people are having these conversations and they're being meaningful. You're going to know if it's sustainable or not. It depends on how steeped in the culture it is. So, monitoring, communication, assessment results are supposed to be broadly shared. That makes a lot of people very uncomfortable. And it tends to raise questions about, are you using this to assess my performance? And that is not the point. The point is to make improvements. You're likely to have that response. There are any number of people who will have that response because that is sort of the go-to response from assessment for many, many years. But if you can really take the point of view that this is about improvement, this is about our students being successful, then that's the conversation you need to have. You can have departmental outcomes, so for the faculty, but also for if you're counseling or if you're advising or any other kinds of departments, you can have conversations about the overall outcomes of students and where there may be gaps without comparing people's individual performance. You want to know what they're learning and what they're not. And you want to have those general conversations around what can we do differently. I know that when you start having those conversations, it can devolve into turf issues and, who's doing what. But this is why it should be within the department and not necessarily from top down. That makes sense? Okay. So communication, strategic planning and budgeting, closing the loop. This was before I hated closing the loop, so okay, so the excelling category for this, basically in that area says institutional commitment to using assessment results to inform improvements. All units regularly use assessment data to close the loop. The institution presents evidence that assessment results, including student learning assessment, are routinely used for institutional improvement, effectiveness, and planning. If you're using them, you need to go back and look at them. So if I were to rewrite this now, I would use assessment spiral instead. It's actually, you'd be made a magnet out of that. Assessment spiral looks like a tornado. Just saying. Okay, so that's where to find it. You are not alone in this process. Like I mentioned, there are others in your cohort. So, what I would encourage you to do would be to reach out to others in your cohort to find out what they're doing. You know, they're all going to probably be at the Self-Study Institute when your representatives are at the Self-Study Institute. You can gather moral support, you can share information, you can talk about formats, you can talk about evidence inventory problems you're having, any number of things like that. But I think particularly knowing that Canton is in the same cohort as you guys gives you someone else from the tech sector to talk to. And I would encourage you to do that. Okay, team visit. Usually they start on a Sunday, they end on a Wednesday. The Sunday thing is typically some kind of getting to know you kickoff event. Might be a reception, might be a dinner, might, you know, who knows who shows up for that. You're going to invite certain people to be there. Typically self-study co-chairs and steering committee members and other folks who might be important to particular standards. And then you pair them up with whoever's on the team looking at certain things. Typically 6 to 8, but it depends on the size of the institution and the kinds of particular questions and concerns. When you write your self-study design, you get a chance to say, here are some of the things we really want team expertise in. Because these are basically consultants. If you get people with certain kinds of expertise, they can give you advice. Okay. Make sure the information they need is readily available and that they are well looked after. I go on these visits typically. I go to the community colleges, I go to whoever my reviewing campuses are. My other colleagues go to. So Fred Hildebrand is your reviewer. Fred's very good at these visits. He will probably be, unless something happens, he will probably be the person who will come on your team visit. The SUNY liaison is an interpreter for the team. And the more the team is able to accept and work with this person, the more likely it is that you're going to have someone who can basically seek things out, give you information, get coffee for them. I mean, I do everything. Once I had to drive the team chair to the emergency room. You know, the SUNY liaison has a very broad job description. But you want to look after the team. These are people who are going to be asking you questions, trying to figure out if you're in compliance with the standards. The more cooperative you are with them. So, true story. One institution had not a Middle States visit, but a program accreditation visit, and the team members were asking questions, and this person took offense that they were asking questions and didn't give them information. Guess what happened? they were found out of compliance. So this is the kind of thing. They are going to ask for information, and they're going to ask for it when they're there. They might ask for it in advance, or something that happens within an interview may spark an interest in some other piece of documentation. So be ready to dig, be ready to find them what they ask for, give it to them as soon as you possibly can, and, you know, answer their questions openly and honestly. That's going to give you your best. So, and you should not draw conclusions about what questions they're asking. I think very often when people come out of an interview, particularly if it's very pointed and they're asking very specific questions, they draw conclusions where they think, oh, this one's really out of control and they're trying to make us look bad. Or, I'm not comfortable with where that's going. You know what happens in a team visit is, the first night, you share your preliminary interpretations of what's going on. Typically these days, team members will have their report almost written when they get to the first meeting. Have any of you ever been on evaluation teams? Okay. I would recommend it if you have an opportunity. They're looking for reviewers, and it's a great professional development opportunity if you are so inclined. But the first night, it's like, okay, well, here are the questions I have. This is what I'm seeing. This is what I think. Then they get into the first day. And it's, oh my God, this place is in such bad shape. And they keep digging. After their team meeting the first night, you know, they're like, we really have a lot more questions. We're going to have to ask a lot more questions here. And after the second night, it's like, oh, okay, that was an issue. I'm fine with that now. I've talked to these people. It's okay. So people who are drawing conclusions based on the first day are going to have a very different picture of what's going on than based on the second. And they're going to hash it out on the final night and figure out what it is that they're going to recommend. Questions about that? It's a whole dynamic. I mean, it's a rather fascinating thing. Oops.
As you're describing it, it seems a bit subjective. So can you talk about the subjective object? I mean, there's all this data that we're putting together, and that should actually sing the praise, right?
So this is a concern, and I think this is why they are looking to regularize, standardize the recommendation process. I'm going to talk in a minute about how you make that kind of judgment in the team. Yes, it feels very subjective. And the threshold of how you determine that an institution is in compliance or out of compliance is going to vary from team to team. But I'll talk a little more about the process at Middle States and how they try to counteract that. Okay, so basically the team has to decide if you meet the standard in substantial measure. And this is something that they've been saying it's not a checklist, it's not a checklist. And then, some of the folks who've been through this say, yeah, it's a checklist. You want to make sure you have everything. If you look at the standards, there are some criteria that are obviously much more far-reaching and important than others. And so how you meet those things and whether or not you are meeting them in substantial measure. So go back to the heat map, right? Think about that, the amount of blue and the amount of red. If you see that initially, you're going to say, okay, tell me more about this red thing. What's going on with that? And as you talk to people, you may find more information about what they've done since. And remember, there's a time lag between when you submit your self-study and when the team actually gets there. So that's another piece of the criteria. So they will be looking to try to determine the extent to which you are in compliance with the standards. And they have to make the determination in substantial measure. And this, okay, if a failure is a danger to fulfilling your mission, okay, that's really important. If it's a linkage to any requirements of affiliation or to the other standards, that's also a big deal. And if it's a breach of state or federal law, obviously. But those are the three criteria that I was on a follow-up visit for a non-compliance finding, and the Middle States Vice President on that visit actually articulated this in a way that I thought was really helpful. So I think that what I've seen the most, if you're looking at assessment, your linkages, particularly with institutional assessment, are going to go back to planning and budgeting. Right? In the previous set of standards, that meant that your assessment pieces and your standard, what was formerly standard 2, which was the planning piece, were connected. And so if you failed 2, the planning piece, you were going to fail 7, the assessment piece. You see, because if you don't have a plan, you can't assess where you're going. So the connection amongst the standards matters. And so when they're looking at the totality of all these things, they're looking at a lot of different aspects. They will always request. They may change their interview schedule based on, if you're a small institution and they've asked for people by their titles or by the role they play, they may find out that they're interviewing the same person over and over again. And say, okay, I don't really need to talk to you again. I need to talk to this other person. That happens all the time. You should not draw conclusions from that. It just simply means that they've gotten answers they needed or they found other questions they had. Okay. So there will be a report from the team. This will indicate whether the team's judgment you've met the standard or not. That is not the final verdict. So the team has findings. The team says, okay, in our judgment, the institution appears to meet the standard or appears to not meet the standard. And then they will have to give evidence in support of that conclusion. The final report is typically on a Wednesday morning, and the team gives the report and they leave. There are no questions, there's no anything. That's not a reflection on anybody. That is Middle States policy. They need to get out of Dodge immediately. And you can imagine if they had to deliver a really negative report to somebody, the last thing they would want to do is stand around and try and answer questions. that's not appropriate for the venue and the issue. The team exits immediately. The SUNY liaison does not have to. Not bound by that. So what I will typically do, and I believe Fred would probably if you asked him to, I typically do a debrief afterwards with the campus leadership. The content of the discussions with the team, if I have access to that, it's confidential. You don't get that. But because the recommendations are so generic coming from the commission, very often the campus does not understand what it is they actually are needing to do. So it's my job afterwards to kind of help them understand what their next steps need to be. So what happens is you will get an opportunity initially with a draft report to correct errors of fact. The team's there for like 2.5 days, right? They interview maybe 200 people. They might get something wrong. It's possible. If there's an error of fact, that gets pointed out in the response to the draft report. Then when the final report comes out, you get to make a formal response to the report. And this is where you were very successful after your follow-up visit last time. Because Provost Nader is one of the only people that I've ever known who's been able to do a response to a team finding that was successful in overturning the team finding. So it happens. But the response needs to be evidence-based. It needs to demonstrate. So what he did, I don't think this is a secret, but what he did was basically say, here's what we were directed to do. Here's what we did. I don't understand why your finding is out of compliance. So that goes to this committee. There is a committee. They review all of the information. The team chair makes a recommendation to the committee. And they review, 10, 12 institutions at a time. The committee does, and what they're trying to do is look at similar types of institutions and strive for consistency across those results. I first started making arguments about this because I was seeing significant differences between community colleges and tech sector reports, which are basically drawing from the same pool of assessors, of evaluators, and comprehensive and youth centers. So, for example, a community college report, and it with very similar results, okay? All these three institutions have very similar results. Community college was put on warning, the comprehensive institution had a follow-up visit, and the youth center had a clean bill of health for 5 years. Very similar results. So, I had an issue with that. And talked with Middle States, and, they will say that this is mission-driven. So if, for example, community colleges had a research standard, it might have very different kinds of results from a youth center. Granted. However, what I have noticed in the language since then is that they no longer say they're striving for consistency across the board. They will say they're striving for consistency within sectors, which is a very different thing. So if you are going to look for input on what other groups have done, what other institutions have done, I would argue you should look at the tech sector institutions, you should look at the community colleges and see what they've done, because they're going to be further along in a lot of this than some of the other institutions. That's not a diss. It's simply a reflection of what happens when it's peer review. Teaching and learning for the CCs and the tech sector are really right up front. There are very important aspects of the institution. I would not say that it's not important in the comprehensives. It is, but it's not the same. You have research requirements and things like that. And then you have, folks at the youth centers who basically, they see their jobs as research, and grad assistants do the teaching. So there are going to be differences in the findings. And that, I think, is just it's an artifact of the process. It's very frustrating to me anyway, but I think, it's a way, I'm trying to frame how you can look at the results and how you can interpret the results. Okay, so the committee reviews all the information, and then they make a recommendation to the commission, and nothing is final until the commission acts. So, because they may overturn something the team decided, which they have done. I have had institutions who did not understand that finding them out of compliance with the standard was a bad thing. They said, oh, we passed, we passed 13 out of 14. Let's celebrate. Okay, that's not that's not the way you want to go. Non-compliance is a serious deal. So I wouldn't be celebrating if we didn't, if you didn't pass a standard. You'd want to immediately know, what do I have to do to get back in compliance in the best way possible? Now, the good news from the negotiated rulemaking that's been going on is that they've negotiated a longer time period for response to non-compliance issues. So our institution that was out of compliance with 7 out of 14 standards, they had 2 years to come back into full compliance. And that's from the judgment of non-compliance to the judgment of compliance, which leaves you about 18 months to do all the work. Not the best scenario. They had 2 follow-up visits in that time period. So you can imagine, and so this is what they're responding to. Okay, so that's what I've got. Questions, additional questions? Are there things that you want to be able to? The question about how do you meet standard 6? It really comes down to what your goals and objectives are, and it comes down to linking to the budget, planning and budgeting. As I said earlier, I really do believe that if you include assessment information, assessment evidence in your budgeting process with the planned steps responding to that, you're going to have very good demonstration of linkages. In fact, one of the Middle States guys that I've been on many teams with, he says, just put it on the proposal. Put it on the budget proposal. Here's the assessment stuff. This is what it's in support of. These evidence-based outcomes are the reason we are proposing this, which we expect will answer this issue. And here are the budget implications of that. So from my perspective, probably it's not impossible to advocate for a computer lab or additional faculty or to build something. I would say that you probably don't want to go there unless it's super, super, super evident that what you are finding in your assessment would benefit from that particular request. There may be any number of things which could be done to address the issue before coming to that. And those are things that are, those are high ticket items that may or may not be possible to do anything with. But that is usually the first request that I find from people is, well, we need another faculty member, or we need another staff member, or we need to have a new lab, or we need to have this equipment or that equipment. In many cases, that may be entirely, viable. In other cases, maybe not. But you need to have some kind of a rationale for why that particular request would answer the issues that are raised in the assessment analysis. Does that make sense? So Standard 6 is challenging because it's not only unit level assessment outside of academics. It's also the entire picture for the institution. And it goes to resource allocation, and it goes to institutional renewal, all of those things. So, but a piece of it, a huge piece of it, is the unit level assessments in the non-academic areas. And those have been of major focus in recent years. I know that we've had a lot of workshops on those. Do you guys have questions, specific questions about anything to do with non-academic assessment? Go ahead.
For academic assessment, we have our entire, our one-person IR department.
Right.
And there's tons of data about everything, but when it comes to non-academic assessment, and we talked about work orders, but
Right.
I think the challenge is coming up with data you can actually look at and rely on for real evidence
Yep.
of something.
Yep. So I can tell you what I did with the provost's office where I used to work. We would get phone calls all the time from parents, local, community members, any number of questions and concerns and all kinds of things like that. What we did was we logged all of them. Just basically kept a log of here were the kinds of, and then we and the subject. So we could see, okay, here are the kinds of questions we're getting most of. So do we have a standard response to that? Is there something we could do proactively that would help to address that issue? Is there, are we consistently responding to those questions? If you have different staff people responding to different questions, you may get a variable response. So we wanted to know what is the most common or are the most common kinds of questions that we get in the provost's office. And how can we better make that information available? And how can we improve how we address those questions? So that's the kind of thing that I would say, as I said with surveys and things like that, those tend to be the first go-to things for non-academic units. And they're great for indicating where you would want to dig deeper. But I don't see them as conclusive. And you don't want to run into the situation where they say you're over-relying on qualitative data. Now, as I said before, qualitative matters. It tells you what's important to people. It tells you what you ought to be counting. Okay? You shouldn't just count stuff to count stuff. You should count it because it matters. So qualitative helps to point to what matters. Focus groups, things like that, can give you a pretty good indication. If you are getting, for example, campus safety, certain areas of the campus are proving to be problematic. Maybe there are lighting issues. You can talk to a group of students, a representative group of students, and ask them questions. And then use that information. That would be more direct evidence because it's coming from the students directly themselves. And they can tell you why they said what they said. And then you can look at, are there incident reports which support that? Are there, what's your Clery Act report say? So there's a lot of information that you have that you probably haven't been thinking about as evidence. That's my guess. You can log things, you can track things, but the most important thing is, what are the trends? So if you're seeing trends in what's going on, I keep coming back to the issues of diversity because they've become so much more prominent lately. If you have a campus climate survey, okay, fine. You've got something that tells you what students as a whole think. What can you add to that to do a deeper dive to find out what's really going on? And is it disproportionate? Is it, are there on-campus issues versus off-campus issues? Do any of these have to do with online? So there may be cyberstalking stuff. There may be, any number of things. But that's what you don't know from the survey. So the survey is the jumping off point for a deeper dive in to try and figure out what's really going on so you can take specific actions, link them to the budget, and then figure out whether it gets better or worse. I don't know if that helps, but I don't have a one specific answer for that.
Going back to something you touched on briefly this morning in terms of the objectives versus the learning outcomes as we talk about non-classroom assessment, I think that's something that we've struggled a little bit on campus. There was a huge focus for student learning outcomes, and I'm in the library, so we're a little bit lucky because we can do student learning outcomes, but we do have objectives that we work on. But I know that many of my colleagues in the non-classroom areas have struggled with that, and so now hearing you talk about the fact that there's been a shift in doing the objectives, can you just elaborate a little bit on that and what those might look like? Because I think that could really help.
Sure. Well, I think I was getting at it a little bit with the example about the student services thing that came up, where they were tracking the attendance and making decisions, operational decisions, based on the patterns of student behavior. What they missed, and what would be a student learning outcome, would be based on what they were there to do. So if you were seeing patterns in what they were coming for, and it raised questions about, do students not understand their financial obligations? Do they not understand? Are they having issues with diversity? Are there sort of harassment things that are going on? What are they coming for help with? Then you have the possibility of saying, okay, I think a student learning outcome in this area might be students will be able to seek the appropriate department for the kinds of help that they need, or it might be students will understand financial obligations better, and you'll see that by a reduction in the number of late payments or things sent to collections. There may be any number of ways in which you could determine that, and there is a certain overlap that comes with particularly the units which bridge that, like the library tends to do. So you have operational things that you're concerned about. You want to be sure that you're being efficient and effective. You want to be sure that the whatever interlibrary loan thing is going on these days, that dates me. But if that's working the way it needs to within the time frames it needs to, all those kinds of things. But also then, information management and information literacy tend to be based in the library. So you have both kinds, and you need both kinds. But for, for your maintenance folks, I would argue if you absolutely had to have a student learning outcome, you would want to track things like, are there issues with the classroom? Are there issues with, so if you have a classroom which is consistently freezing, does that have an impact on student learning? I would argue probably does. Is there something that needs to be done constructively? I got a response on that. Something that needs to be done constructively to have an impact on student learning. So depending on how closely related to student interaction you are, I often had that conversation when we were, that concern came from me at one point initially because we were hearing from teams that they were looking at student learning outcomes in every department. Now, clearly, with the change in the standards, the language is different, and I think you can certainly make the case that you don't have to. I don't know if that helps to clarify for you, but I do think you have to consider the role, mission of the department, what it is you're trying to accomplish, and how much interaction you have with students. Is that interaction in the kind of situation where there's something that helping them learn something would make a difference in your operations? So having students better understand financial aid cycles might cut down on waiting time if they're waiting in line to talk to somebody around the times that aid is released. We always have people standing in the hallway and sitting in chairs waiting to talk to financial aid people at certain times of the year. So the question would be, what's not happening that we have that? I know you have another question. Go ahead.
I have to say the Middle States videos, I've only watched this one on Standard 6, and it's incredibly dense. And the one thing that they talk about over and over is the effective use of resources.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, is it just a matter of assessing whatever resources you received in the prior year, and that is how you demonstrate to the peer review team that at least considered whether or not using resources effectively, or what is the best way of showing that?
Yeah, one of the big challenges for some of these things that they say you need to assess constantly. Assessing the appropriate use of resources is a difficult thing to do. And they are talking about more than money. They're talking about people, they're talking about physical plant, they're talking about technology. So depending on what it is, would mean you're going to have a different approach. So if it's a human resources issue, you don't have enough people to do what you have to do, there needs to be some way of looking at that. How do you know you don't have enough people to do what you have to do? Is it a question of wait times? Is it a question of productivity issues? Is it a question of efficiency? What is the issue? If it's a question of physical resources, physical plant stuff, then we talked about some of those things already, but do you have the physical setup? One of the things that actually, and this is a human resource thing, one institution that I was with a team at, they were fine with institutional effectiveness until the team member visited the IR department. And they found there was one IR person for, can't tell you how many thousands of students. And basically this person spent more time doing union complaints and that type of thing than they did actually doing IR. And that institution was always late with submissions. So it was clearly a problem that the IR in that institution was not supporting the institutional effectiveness efforts of the work. And that, you would know, well, you kind of walk in the office and you can see it, but you would know from the kind of accumulated evidence that this is not going the way it's supposed to. And people would complain because they don't have the information they need to be able to draw the conclusions they need to draw. So that's a human resource example. Physical plant is harder. Technology, okay. At an institution that was offering online courses, and students, they had problems with their Wi-Fi. Students could get on the Wi-Fi at home and take the online course. They couldn't do it in the learning center at the campus. So that's the kind of thing, you can, depending on the issues that are arising, you would want to look at different stuff. I think, how am I doing for time? Okay, so thank you for your kind attention and best of luck.
Thank you very much, Dr. Moeckel.